Good morning. Welcome. Welcome to this virtual and in-person service of the Idaho Falls Unitarian Universalist Church on this beautiful October 22nd day of October 2023. We welcome you. We know you come here for different reasons: to find community, to seek your spiritual and personal truths, to question, to nurture your heart and soul, to be nurtured, to explore new ideas, to find comfort, and perhaps to find the answers to some of your bigger questions. We welcome you. We know you come from different places, different religions, different beliefs, and different backgrounds. We hope you will find comfort, connection, challenge, and love here. We hope you will find ways to provide outreach to others in our congregation, in our local community, and in our world community. Welcome to this sacred place. Come, let us worship, celebrate, grieve, and love together. If you're watching online, please sign into the chat box so that we may know who is attending, and also it will enable you to send in your joys and concerns. I am Ron Goen, and I will be assisting Reverend Kevin Carson in the service this morning. Announcements. Does anyone have announcements this morning? Reverend Kevin has an announcement to make.
This Friday evening on October 27th, we're going to be welcoming a group of BYU Idaho students who are visiting from their Interfaith Academic Society, and they want to learn more about what Unitarian Universalism is and about the interfaith work we do, and it'll be probably at least 25, could be more. And so I'm inviting everyone to show up who can. 6:30 Friday evening. If you can bring any kind of refreshments like coffee hour, that would be great too. So please let me know if you're planning to attend. They'd love to meet more than just me. I'll be here obviously to talk about, I'm going to start with a kind of a short story of who we are and where we came from, and then do some question and answer time, and then we'll have a kind of informal time for them just to meet and talk to people about what UU means to them. So I'd love to have as many people as we can get, quite frankly. Like I said, there's probably going to be at least 25 students, so I don't want to be 25, versus me asking questions, because it'd be great to, they really want to learn about our faith, and they come from a variety of backgrounds, but it's not a religious group, it's an academic group that's studying interfaith action and so forth, so I think it'd be really great. I've had multiple conversations with them, even got interviewed for a podcast earlier this week, so I think it'd be nice to really show them a warm welcome when they come, so thanks. 6:30 Friday night. And like I said, just let me know if you're planning to attend, just so I can get a feel, and if you can bring any kind of refreshments, that'd be great.
And please silence your cell phones. I should have mentioned that. I've left my cell phone at home this morning, so I don't know what I'm doing. And if you have joys and concerns, please write them on a sheet back in the corner, and we'll read those a little bit later. It's time now to ring the peace bowl. Let us prepare ourselves for worship. Calm our hearts, our minds, our breathing. Breathe deeply in and out, listening to your breath as I ring the peace bowl 3 times. Our church's covenant helps us remember why we are a part of this faith and why we give our time and our resources to this congregation. If you so choose, please recite along with me the covenant that this congregation has chosen to live by. Love is the spirit of this community, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. And now we'll light the chalice, accompanied by the words from Albert Schweitzer. At times, our own light goes out and is rekindled by a spark from another person. Each of us has cause to think with deep gratitude of those who have lighted the flame within us.
Good morning. Our call to worship this morning is the poem Wage Peace by Judith Hill. Wage peace with your breath. Breathe in firemen and rubble. Breathe out whole buildings and flocks of red-winged blackbirds. Breathe in terrorists and breathe out sleeping children and freshly mown fields. Breathe in confusion and breathe out maple trees. Breathe in the fallen and breathe out lifelong friendships intact. Wage peace with your listening. Hearing sirens, pray loud. Remember your tools, flower seeds, clothespins, clean rivers. Make soup, play music. Learn the word for thank you in 3 languages. Learn to knit and make a hat. Think of chaos as dancing raspberries. Imagine grief as the outbreath of beauty or the gesture of fish. Swim for the other side. Wage peace. Never has the world seemed so fresh and precious. Have a cup of tea and rejoice. Act as if armistice has already arrived. Celebrate today. I invite you now to rise in body or spirit and join in singing our opening hymn, number 1, May Nothing Evil Cross This Door.
May nothing evil cross this door, and may your fortune never pry about these windows with a roar, and rain go by. By faith made strong, the rafters will withstand the battering of the storm. This hearth, though all the world grow chill, will keep you warm. Peace shall walk softly through these rooms, touching our lips with holy wine, till every casual corner blooms into a shrine. With laughter drown the raucous shout, and though these sheltering walls are thin, may they be strong to keep hate out and hold love in.
Good morning. This morning's Time for All Ages is titled, Are Your Stars Like My Stars? It was written by Leslie Halakowski and illustrated by Heidi Woodward Sheffield. Are your stars my stars? We look at the world every day, you and me. Do we see the same things? Do you see what I see? When you squint at the sky, do you see the same hue, deep, wide, and open? Is your blue like my blue? When the sun gazes down, shining yellow and bold, is it warm, full of sparkle? Is your gold like my gold? When you dig in the dirt, planting seeds in the ground, is it earthy and rich? Is your brown like my brown? Do you splash in a puddle when the world is washed clean? Are the leaves fresh and bright? Is your green like my green? When you stroll in an orchard, do the sweet smells fill your head? Is the fruit bold and flashy? Is your red like my red? Does your shadow grow long as the sun starts to sink? Are the clouds soft and rosy? Is your pink like my pink? When your eyes are shut tight, do you peek? Just a crack. Is the night smooth and sleepy? Is your black like my black? When you stare at the stars, do you see the same light? Does it glow in the darkness? Is your white like my white? That's a llama. We look at each other every day, you and me. Do we see the same things? Do I see what you see? And we will now sing our one child upstairs to have some good fun.
As we leave this friendly place, love give light to every face. May the kindness which we learn light our hearts till we return.
Time now for joys and concerns. Reverend Kevin will light a candle for each of these. First one is from Victoria. It's a welcome to Cameron, Heather, and if I pronounce this, am I too close? Up? Like this? All right. I will never get this right. All right. Welcome to Cameron, Heather, and is it Ariella and Mike. This is from Victoria, and welcome. And one from Karen Schaefer. Last weekend, the Scandi dancing in Salt Lake City. They saw old friends since before COVID, my goodness, learning dances from Telemark, Norway. Sounds like a lot of fun. And from Victoria, my sister-in-law has recovered from COVID. And another from Victoria, the leaves are gorgeous even though they mean they must be raked. Yes, the leaves are gorgeous. And Reverend Kevin has one additional concern or sorrow.
Yes, last week we didn't have joys and sorrows, but if we had, I would have lit a candle of sorrow for the Reverend Michael Dowd, who passed away suddenly from a heart attack recently. He was a wonderful speaker. Some of you have, I'm sure, heard him speak in the past, and he was an advocate for earth spirituality and evolution, and spreading education about climate change and living with the inevitable changes, what he called the post-doom mentality of the world, and finding hope even despite what we're going to be going through as far as the inevitable climate change. So he died of a heart attack suddenly, and he will be missed, and our hearts go out to his wife, Connie Barlow, who was part of his mission. They used to travel around with a van that had a Jesus fish and a Darwin fish kissing each other years ago, and just preached to anybody that could get an audience with about how evolution and traditional religion, everything can fit together and not be at odds. So he'll be sorely missed.
Are there any joys and concerns in the chat box? None. We will light one additional candle for those joys and concerns that we choose to hold in our hearts.
I'm getting over a cold, so my voice hopefully will stay steady today. We'll see what happens. Instead of our typical readings this morning, I'm going to share with you two brief stories from a trip I made to Israel-Palestine in 2013 as part of a group of 30 seminarians and faculty from Andover Newton Theological School and Boston University. In the stories, I will talk more about what made this educational trip a bit unique. I've called my first story An Evening in Beit Sahur. On the evening of May 26, 2013, I stayed in the home of Jamila and Atala Danoon in the Palestinian town of Beit Sahur, about a 40-minute drive south of Jerusalem. Beit Sahur is near Bethlehem and the occupied West Bank, and the town is most famous for being the home of two disputed locations that are claimed to be the shepherd's field in the Nativity story, the place where the angels announced the birth of Jesus to the shepherds, according to the Gospel of Luke. One site is venerated by the Roman Catholic Church, and the other by the Eastern Orthodox Church. Of course, there are two disputed locations. This is typical of the way things are in the Holy Land. Today, the town of Beit Sahur is around 12,000 people in population. It consists of shops and homes scattered across a very hilly terrain, and the residents are a mixture of Muslim and Christian Palestinians, about an 80-20 split. The Danoons are a Muslim family on the progressive end of the spectrum. They are spiritual but do not adhere to a strict prayer schedule, and they prefer to wear Western clothing. Jamila and her husband, Atala, were both in their 60s at the time of my visit. Atala was a school teacher in the local Orthodox Christian school, and Jamila was a prodigious homemaker and peace activist with an amazingly abundant garden on her tiny piece of land. She belonged to a group of Palestinian and Israeli women who were working for dialogue and peace. They have several children and grandchildren who lived with them or nearby, and a couple of their children were in college abroad at the time. 4 of us from my group were staying with the Danoons that evening. We were participating in a program designed to help us develop an appreciation of the complicated politics of this troubled region by listening to the stories of people from a wide range of perspectives. During our journey, we visited the ancient and modern historical sites, and we also listened to the stories of Israelis and Palestinians from all walks of life. We met with Jews, Muslims, and Christians, peace workers like Jamila and Zionist Jewish settlers, Muslim shopkeepers in Hebron, and a former member of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament. We even spoke with a retired colonel from the Israeli Defense Force who planned the route of the controversial Israeli West Bank barrier, the fortified 430-mile-long, 26-foot-tall concrete wall that now separates Israeli and Palestinian territories. Beit Sahur lies on the Palestinian side of the wall, and the Danoons will tell you about the hardships and severe restrictions on travel they and other Palestinians endure because of it. The colonel will tell you about the necessity for the wall, how it protects Israelis from the very real threat of terrorism. While both sides can make good arguments for their point of view, it is difficult to view the wall stretching across the landscape with its armored guard towers and razor wire without feeling something is very wrong here. For me, it evoked uncomfortable feelings of my memories of visits to historic ghettos and concentration camps, Warsaw, Auschwitz, and even Sheriff Joe Arpaio's Arizona prison camp. Sitting there in their living room that evening, we struggled through barriers of language but communicated remarkably well. The Danoons spoke of their admiration for the King of Jordan, their contempt for Syria's Bashar al-Assad, and their distrust of the current Palestinian leadership. They spoke of life before and after what Palestinians refer to as al-Nakba, which means the catastrophe. Al-Nakba was the forced relocation of more than 700,000 Palestinians from their homes during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War that erupted in the aftermath of the United Nations vote to create the modern state of Israel. Hundreds of Palestinian villages throughout Palestine were emptied of their residents by intimidation or outright murder, what is now called ethnic cleansing, and the refugees were forced into Gaza or the West Bank. Israelis celebrate the same event as a great victory in the Milchemet Ha'atzmaut, the War of Independence. The emptied Palestinian villages were either destroyed or quickly occupied by European Jews who immigrated to Israel in the aftermath of the Holocaust. That evening in Beit Sahur, we discussed many controversial topics, but I don't want to leave you with the impression that the conversation was all politics. Like people you encounter in every culture, most of the stories they told us were about their family, especially their children's educational and professional successes. They were also eager to learn about where we came from and what we thought of our experience. I will cherish the memories of my visit with the Danoons. I've called my second story A Peace Activist Born of Intifada. Our tour of Israel-Palestine was organized through a company called Mejdi, which means to honor in Arabic. Mejdi is a joint Jewish-Arab venture founded by 3 conflict resolution specialists, Aziz Abusara, Scott Cooper, and Mark Gopin. Their unusual business model was based on promoting dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians and sharing these stories with their clients to promote a greater understanding of the region's issues. And unlike most companies, they also emphasize giving back to the local communities financially. Each of their tours of Israel-Palestine is led by a Palestinian and an Israeli guide. And the guides provide a dual narrative approach throughout the tour. In recent years, they've expanded their tours to other countries with a similar approach. Our Palestinian guide was the co-founder, Aziz Abu Sara. Aziz grew up in Palestinian East Jerusalem, and as a boy, he experienced firsthand the violence of the Palestinian uprising of the late 1980s and early 90s, known as the First Intifada. The Intifada, which means shaking off in Arabic, was a period of protest against Israeli occupation that often led to violent clashes. During one such episode, Aziz's older brother, only a teenager at the time, was arrested and then endured prolonged torture in prison. He was released only shortly before he died from his injuries, suffering from multiple organ failure. He was only released so they could report that he didn't officially die in custody. In an interview with National Geographic, Aziz said, "I was so bitter and angry, all I could think about was revenge." As a result, he joined the resistance movement as a teenager, where he helped fan the flames of hatred and organize demonstrations against the so-called peace process. In Israel, all students are required to study Hebrew, even if you're a Palestinian, but Jewish students are not required to study Arabic. Aziz refused to learn Hebrew in school, what he called the language of the enemy. After he graduated from high school, though, Aziz realized that learning Hebrew would be necessary for him to pursue higher education. So he enrolled in a Hebrew class designed for new Jewish immigrants to Israel. He was the only Palestinian in the class, and to his astonishment, he began to meet and form friendships with Jews for the first time. It may be hard for us to believe, but like many Palestinians, until that class, the only Jewish people he had encountered in person were police with guns. This began an ongoing transformation of Aziz into the person he has become. Listening directly to the stories of the other broke down barriers of misconception and prejudice. He could no longer see them as simply the people who killed his brother. The understandable anger that had driven him to demonize all Jews was transformed into sadness and determination. He now works for peace and conflict resolution. He has dedicated his life to using personal stories and cross-cultural learning to bring about the social change so desperately needed in the region. In addition to leading tours for Mejdi, Aziz works with a variety of organizations, writes articles and books, hosts radio programs, blogs, and lectures worldwide, including TED Talks. When we said goodbye in Tel Aviv, Aziz was headed to Jordan to work with Syrian refugees. We stay connected through Facebook, and unfortunately, there has been plenty of work to keep Aziz busy. An offering to support the mission of this church will now be given and gratefully received. Watching the news from Israel and Gaza over the last couple of weeks has been difficult, to say the least. Like most people, as this human tragedy continues to unfold, I find myself experiencing a range of emotions from horror and anger to fear and utter despair. So many lives lost on both sides, especially children and young adults. So much grief and sorrow poured out on an already hurting world. The atrocities committed by Hamas are grotesque and inexcusable. And the retaliatory bombing of Gaza, one of the most densely populated places on earth, a place often called the world's largest open-air prison, has already killed over 4,000 Palestinians and has created a terrible humanitarian crisis that can't be ignored. It is understandable that Israel wants to cripple Hamas to prevent future attacks. But cutting off food, water, fuel, electricity, and medical supplies to a population of over 2 million people is a form of collective punishment that seems more like revenge than a military operation. Protests around the world are calling for a ceasefire amid the very real threat that the conflict could evolve into a regional war like the world witnessed in 1948, 1967, and 1973. While at the same time, some of the hardliners on both sides see the conflict as an opportunity to destroy their enemies once and for all. And our country's continued military support for Israel has already begun to reinforce anti-America hatred. Violence in the Middle East has a long history, of course, stretching back to ancient times. But what we see unfolding right now is probably the greatest crisis in more than half a century. Like anyone who has visited the Holy Land, I suspect, I find myself reminiscing lately about the time I spent in Israel and the West Bank back in 2013. I worry about the wonderful people I met there and how this latest round of violence will radicalize another generation on both sides of the conflict, a fresh infusion of hatred and distrust. It is a harsh reminder of the many unresolved issues between Palestinians and Israelis. They have been ongoing for at least the last 75 years and really over a century since the British replaced the Ottoman rulers following the First World War. Each side is locked in an historic narrative that blames the other, competing stories that fuel the ceaseless conflict. And it seems impossible at times to imagine the situation will ever improve. But maybe, just maybe, enough people can begin to listen to each other and let in a glimmer of hope. Maybe enough people can escape the old stories long enough to get to know each other and begin to form a new story, to begin to ask, like the children in our Time for All Ages story, do I see what you see? On the last evening of my 2013 trip, several members of my group gathered on the terrace of our hotel in the ancient city of Tiberias, overlooking the Sea of Galilee. Aziz, who I just told you about, suggested to the group that it is difficult for Americans to really appreciate the Palestinian narrative since our nation has never experienced such conquest and defeat. As I thought about it, I generally agreed, but I told him that there are at least two similar stories in our history to consider. First, of course, is the story of the Native American experience under European colonialism. And second is the story of the American Civil War and its aftermath. Aziz found this second point very intriguing, and as the only Southerner in our group, I became the de facto spokesman for the Southern worldview for the rest of the evening. As I explained to the group, looking at the Civil War from the Southern perspective can help us to better understand the Palestinian narrative. Although the Civil War ended more than 150 years ago, When you consider how the echoes of that conflict still linger in the cultural narrative of the South, it is easy to understand many of the regional, political, and social differences in America in our own time. And even though I am a very progressive Unitarian Universalist who has lived outside the South for more than a couple of decades now, the Civil War is still part of my story in a way that most of my neighbors can't appreciate. Some stories have tremendous power. This is important to remember when we look at conflicts between groups around the world, like the struggle between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It is helpful, I think, to share a little of my own story to show you what I mean. I was born and raised in northwest Georgia, near Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I can't remember a time when I didn't know about the American Civil War. And growing up around several older relatives, I heard many stories that reinforced a narrative of what some Southerners have called the War of Northern Aggression. Some of the bloodiest battles of that war were fought only a few miles from my home. In just the Battle of Chickamauga, for example, the combined casualties totaled more than 34,000 lives. And there were other major battles and dozens of smaller skirmishes fought nearby. Because of the carnage, Chattanooga is home to a large national cemetery. And my father, who served during the Korean conflict, was buried there in 2003. When I visit his grave, one among the vast rows of headstones, the thousands of graves from the Civil War era are a somber reminder of the total cost of that conflict. Most of the dead, like my ancestors who fought in the war, were ordinary folks, blacksmiths, farmers, and shopkeepers. My ancestors only joined the Confederate Army after the war moved into the Tennessee Valley, and their homes and families were at risk. We have no record that any of my ancestors owned slaves, or any indications about how they felt about the institution of slavery, for that matter, though I suspect they accepted it as normal. I sometimes wonder what I would have done had I been alive in the mid-1800s, even with my liberal political and religious leanings. There weren't many Unitarians in the South in those days, but there were many Universalists. And history shows they were divided on the issue of slavery during the war, but reunited afterward. My ancestors were mostly Methodists, and the Methodists also split into separate factions during the war and never quite reconciled. I suspect I too would have joined the Confederate Army and fought for Georgia like my ancestors, though I hope I would have found the institution of slavery as abhorrent as I do now. Times are changing in the South as new people move there from all over, and I believe my generation could likely be the last to feel a strong connection to the Civil War. But the battlefields and monuments and the story remain. It is a complicated legacy that many people oversimplify in the arguments about removing monuments and other symbols of the Confederacy, no matter how well intentioned. Though the so-called lost cause narrative is losing its hold on the modern Southern imagination, for a significant number of Southerners, the Civil War still lives on in the psyche, both in a nostalgic sense of glory and in a shameful memory of destruction and defeat and the difficult period of Reconstruction. From the Southern point of view, the Civil War ended with an occupying army and outsiders usurping many positions of power and authority over the people. It is the story of our Nakba, our catastrophe. We are all born into a sea of stories, and from the first moments of life, we begin to write our own new story into the world. We are who we are, what we think of as our self, can be imagined as an ongoing, evolving story with the self as the protagonist. It is both an inner story of thoughts and feelings known only to ourselves, and an outer story of our interactions with one another. Our experiences are arranged on an internal timeline, and we overlay meaning on this chain of events through the power of symbolic language and concepts. And these symbols are not something we invent ourselves. They are inherited from our parents and our community. They set the context for our story and limit, to some extent, the way our story can be told. Both our good and bad experiences are written into the narrative as our self takes form. And some experiences can be so traumatic that they interrupt the plot of our story in a way that forces us to dramatically change course. A significant illness or trauma can be such an event. When people have experienced a major illness tell their story, it is often bracketed by their life before and after the illness. The illness is a shipwreck in their narrative that forces them to re-examine their story, to come to terms with a new reality, and recontextualize the meaning of prior events. A new story emerges. And the telling of this story to others can be part of the healing that follows. From the larger culture, we become part of even bigger stories, meta-narratives, to use a more technical term. Meta-narratives are stories that offer a comprehensive understanding of history and the world and our place in it. Such grand stories provide a particular worldview that frames our individual story. In the West, the dominant meta-narrative for centuries has been the Judeo-Christian narrative, the common religious and ethical worldview of Judaism and Christianity. Humanity is understood in relationship to God, following an historical trajectory that is often referred to as God's plan. Parts of this narrative are included in Islam as one of the three so-called Abrahamic faiths. But even though meta-narratives are powerful in shaping our individual stories, they too change over time. With the advancement of scientific knowledge, for example, relatively few people still literalize the tale of Adam and Eve or envision the earth as the center of the universe, the way our ancestors once did. And those who cling to such an outdated worldview do so mostly out of ignorance or out of the fear of letting go of past convictions. For religious liberals, the Judeo-Christian meta-narrative has broadened to become more inclusive as we recognize the value of other traditions with their own great stories to contribute. As meta-narratives become woven into the fabric of our personal story, events of the past that we never experienced can profoundly shape the way we see ourselves in the world, that create a sort of virtual experience in the lives of the generations that followed the actual events, but they are very real experiences in terms of how they wield influence. Consider the Nakba, the catastrophe that frames the Palestinian narrative, or the legacy of conflict in Northern Ireland. People who never experienced the actual events have been killing each other for generations, in part because of these stories. But it doesn't have to continue. We need not remain in bondage. We can change our story, rewrite it in a way that liberates and transforms. Even if a powerful meta-narrative remains, it can be reinterpreted in new ways and provide us with valuable insights and perspective. And when narratives collide, it can be an opportunity for everyone to engage in a process of listening and emerging with new stories all around. My friend of Aziz was born into an ongoing conflict with its narrative of suffering and occupation. And while there are many opinions about who deserves more of the blame for the conflict, there is no doubt that the suffering is real on both sides. It would have been easy for Aziz to remain entrenched in his hatred of Israelis, especially after the death of his brother. But he has radically altered the trajectory of his story. Largely through the hearing of the stories of others, Aziz awakened to a new understanding of his own. He is no longer a combatant fighting to win a war against Israel. He is a crusader for peaceful resolution and breaking down the cultural barriers that prejudice and divide Israelis and Palestinians. His story has changed, and sometimes this puts him in conflict with his own family. Aziz told us that his family still warns him to keep on guard around his Israeli counterpart when guiding tours. They're genuinely concerned that he might be knifed in his sleep or meet some other nefarious end, though they're, of course, great friends. But not all stories are easy to hear. Earlier I said that telling one story can be part of the healing process, but it's important to acknowledge that sometimes telling the story of horrific experiences can re-traumatize the storyteller. They may relive the experience in a way because of the profound emotions and memories that well up. This is certainly true of victims of abuse, and I have seen this in interviews of Holocaust survivors. But despite the pain of telling their stories, it is often important that others hear these stories and better understand the horror on at least some basic level. Such stories bear witness. They are testimony to crimes that must not be forgotten. They are also affirmations of survival and life. And sometimes there are seeds of hope in the darkest of our stories. To better understand the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, we must remember that Israelis too have a strong common narrative, despite the often bitter differences between ultra-Orthodox and liberal Jews and the large number of secular Israelis. When I visited Yad Vashem, the Jewish Holocaust memorial near Jerusalem, I was struck by the number of young Israeli soldiers who were visiting that day. Most Israelis are required to serve a tour of military duty, so it is common to see young men and women in uniform in public, often carrying an assault weapon slung over their shoulder. Kobe, our Israeli guide on the trip, explained that Yad Vashem is one of several historic sites that all new Israeli soldiers are required to visit. They visit Yad Vashem to hear the story of the Holocaust and commit themselves to the uncompromising defense of the Jewish people. Never again is their motto. Never again. And having also been to Auschwitz and having seen gas chambers and ovens firsthand, I can appreciate the deep source of such feelings. With an historical connection to the land, Israel became a refuge for Jews in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And given the brutality of their experience, almost any means seemed justified in creating this refuge. Unfortunately, the creation of the State of Israel was clumsily handled by the British and other countries from the start, and despite the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians already living there, Zionist supporters latched onto the idea that Palestine was, quote, a land without a people for a people without a land. It is a meta-narrative that does not stand up to strict historical scrutiny, but it became its own truth for generations to come. And it is a dangerous truth. It is a single story in a place that no single story can fully explain. So long as each side in the struggle takes refuge in a single story that demonizes the other, there will be endless cycles of violence and suffering. Israel is more powerful, but they are not so powerful that they can live in peace and free from fear. And for those Palestinians who refuse to even acknowledge the story of the Israelis, there's little hope of achieving any resolution to their struggle. Both sides need to engage in the practice of listening to the other's story and recognizing the common humanity we all share. Aziz and others like him have demonstrated that the old single story can be rejected and a new one written. We can transcend stories that would bind us in the past. A few years ago, Aziz posted on Facebook that his nephew had been attacked and beaten by a gang of Israeli settlers during a trip to the grocery store near the Mount of Olives in East Jerusalem. Targeting him for simply being a Palestinian, they shouted, "Kill him! Kill him!" as they chased him down. His nephew managed to escape, but suffered some bad contusions and a dislocated shoulder. But even so, his nephew later posted that he did not hate a single Jew, not even those who attacked him. But he did hate the occupation of the West Bank and what it has done to the Palestinian people. On the same day, a Jewish friend of Aziz barely escaped a knife attack at a bus stop, and she too posted on the need for peace and reconciliation. Stories are changing. And this is why, despite the horror and the tragedy, I believe there is hope going forward. Without making excuses for the Hamas attack, perhaps this is an opportunity for the world to stop ignoring the conflict and something good can result. I want to end with this final thought. Part of the magic of stories is that once told, a story is no longer strictly your own. It becomes part of the story of the listener, and it propagates in ways you can't predict. Some of these stories have the ability to chip away at even the most hardened meta-narratives that divide us, brick by brick. And when enough of these individual stories unite, it can change the world. May it be so. I invite you to rise in body or spirit once again and join in singing our closing hymn, number 95, There is More Love Somewhere.
There is more love somewhere. There is more love somewhere. I'm gonna keep on till I find it. There is more love somewhere. There is more hope somewhere. There is more hope somewhere. I'm gonna keep on till I find it. There is more hope somewhere. There is more peace somewhere. There is more peace somewhere. I'm gonna keep on till I find it. There is more peace somewhere. There is more joy somewhere. There is more joy somewhere. I'm gonna keep on till I find it. There is more joy somewhere.
Our closing words of the poem Wild Peace by Yehuda Amichai. Not the peace of a ceasefire, not even the vision of the wolf and the lamb, but rather as in the heart when the excitement is over and you can talk only about a great weariness. I know that I know how to kill. That makes me an adult. And my son plays with a toy gun that knows how to open and close its eyes and say, Mama. A peace without the big noise of beating swords into plowshares, without words, without the thud of the heavy rubber stamp. Let it be light, floating, like lazy white foam. And a little rest for the wounds. Who speaks of healing? And the howl of the orphans is passed from one generation to the next, as in a relay race, the baton never falls. Let it come, like wildflowers, suddenly, because the field must have it. Wild peace.
Please join me in reading the words for extinguishing the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Please join us downstairs for coffee.